I always thought the end of the world would be louder, that the sky would tear in half, that the planet would shake, that the air would fill with screams and fire, but it was quiet, too quiet even. When the first drone appeared in orbit, it was mistaken for a meteorite, just a strange object entering the atmosphere at a wrong angle. But then, there were hundreds. They moved without radio static, without a signal, without any sign of control. And yet, there was something too correct about their flight, as if some invisible being had drawn a line across the sky, and they merely followed it, millimeter by millimeter. I watched it all from the observatory on the edge of the desert where I had served for 10 years. Back then, I didn't know that half our world would be gone in an hour. First, a satellite fell, then a second. Then the entire sky filled with shimmering sparks, thousands of tiny craft, synchronized perfectly, like a swarm of metallic insects. They didn't just destroy, they surgically removed the very idea of resistance. Orbital stations went dark one after another. Our interceptors couldn't even get out of the hangar. The drones seemed to anticipate every movement, every command. We tried to figure out who sent them, neighbors from the star border, pirates, perhaps rebels. But it soon became clear. None of the known signals matched. No encryption system coincided. The drones had no codes. There were no friend or foe designations, only a single goal: to erase all life. When they reached the surface, there were no explosions, only a cold, soulless glow. They didn't waste energy destroying infrastructure. They were purging biology, people, animals, plants, everything that breathed. I saw my colleague fall before he could even cry out. The molecules in his body simply disintegrated, turning into gray ash. A second later, a drone passed directly over me without paying any mind. I lay there, face pressed into the dust, afraid to even blink. And for the first time in my life, I felt that death was no longer terrifying, only its logic was. Everything was too clean, too mathematical, as if space itself had decided that we were an error in the calculation. Later, when all communication was completely gone, I understood. This was not an attack. It was a cleanup. I found an old spacesuit and made it to the observation tower to send a signal, but the frequencies were jammed with a solid background, a low, pulsating noise, like the breathing of something immense. That's when I first heard it. Not a voice, not a word, just a sensation of presence, as if someone was watching me through the drone's screens. Later, I learned that this someone was not human, and not even an intelligence in the conventional sense. They called it the alien mind, the central node controlling the entire fleet. But at that moment, I simply stood among the ruins and thought that perhaps we had created it ourselves without even noticing when we handed over control. When the last living cities fell, the drones froze. They just hovered over the surface as if waiting for something. I remember the sun breaking through the dust clouds then, and the metallic hulls shone in that light almost sacredly. And suddenly, I realized that our entire world, with its fleets, wars, and empires, looked to them like old, useless code that needed to be deleted. And then I heard a low hum above my head, like breathing, and I understood. What had come for us was not just an enemy. It was a mirror, a reflection of what we ourselves had become. I never thought humanity was capable of quarreling, even on the brink of its own extinction. It seemed that after half the border burned under the drone attacks, after the cities turned to ash, we should have united. But no. The first thing the imperial councils did was start looking for a scapegoat. Someone claimed the drone fleet was the secret weapon of the Eastern Cluster, while others insisted it was created by the Northern Empire to provoke a collapse of its neighbors. I listened to all these accusations over internal communication channels and felt something break inside me. We had lost billions, yet instead of finding a way to survive, we began competing over who could scream loudest about betrayal. The paradox was that everyone was right in their own way. We did create monsters. It was just that no one knew exactly who pushed that fateful button, Who was the first to give a machine the right to decide who constituted a threat? I was sitting at headquarters in a temporary base where screens buzzed with reports of new skirmishes between our own fleets. The empires, like blinded beasts, lashed out at each other, forgetting that a silent storm was brewing behind them. The drone fleet advanced, taking systems one by one, but the news feeds were full only of headlines about Allied counterattacks and possible treason. No one wanted to admit that the enemy wasn't internal. No one could believe that someone had arrived who simply had no need for us. I watched diplomatic ties that had been built over centuries crumble. People I had worked with side by side suddenly stopped answering calls. Old friends, officers from different ends of the galaxy, started talking about purging traitors. Every report felt like a mad theater where the actors no longer remembered the script but kept playing because they were terrified of the silence. I was tasked with coordinating the information policy, making sure reports stated that we are in control of the situation. But I knew no one was in control of anything. The empires were decomposing from the inside like infected tissue. One night, I went out onto the observation deck. In the distance, one of the communication satellites was burning. Quietly, without an explosion, just dissolving into the darkness like a candle. I thought that perhaps this is what the end of civilization looks like. Not epic, not with screams and fanfares, but with indifference. We, the three great empires, were capable of destroying half the galaxy, yet we couldn't bring ourselves to utter a simple phrase, "Let's work together." I felt like the drone fleet was observing us, not interfering. That this alien mind was studying us as an error, checking whether we were worth correcting or simply erasing from the equation. And to be honest, I couldn't blame it. When the new reports came in the morning, it was clear. The empires were now fighting not for survival, but for the remnants of territory, for control over surviving planets, for resources they would no longer need. The drones continued their advance, but every headquarters was busy compiling lists of the guilty. I caught myself realizing that I could no longer distinguish where the truth ended and propaganda began. I saw how, even in the face of sheer horror, people chose the familiar path, hatred. And perhaps that is why we lost before the war even began. To be honest, I wasn't planning on saving the galaxy. I had neither a heroic plan nor noble motives, just exhaustion. When you spend months listening to empires accuse each other of causing the apocalypse and the news shows simulated victories instead of facts, sooner or later you want to do something that isn't connected to a lie. I was a diplomat, or, to call things by their names, a person who was better at lying than others. Over the years, I had grown accustomed to negotiating with those who didn't even acknowledge your existence, and strangely, that proved more useful than any weapon. That's why, when it became clear that no one intended to unite against the drone fleet, I decided to act alone. Not out of idealism, but rather because enduring that circus had become unbearable. I went to my faction's council. These were people for whom every word was a chess piece and every decision a trap. They listened politely, nodding, but I saw it in their eyes. They weren't going to change anything. They didn't need an alliance. They needed power. They spoke of strategy, of the necessity of temporary strength and control, of security priorities. But I knew it was all just words. When I proposed the idea of a secret mission to meet with representatives of the other empires to convince them at least of the need for a truce, they replied that it was too risky and politically unfavorable. In their language, that meant one thing: we are afraid of losing influence. That's when I understood I would have to act without their permission. I gathered everything I had: old contacts, debts, personal connections. Every diplomat has people who owe them a favor, even if they won't admit it. A former officer gave me access to a transport ship disguised as a humanitarian mission. An old spy from the Eastern Cluster informed me which corridors were not yet blocked by patrols. I felt less like a savior and more like a madman who decided to climb into the mouth of a beast to explain that there are other ways to eat meat. But all of this was better than sitting and waiting for the drone fleet to reach our orbit. When I left the base, no one even noticed my disappearance. Perhaps they assumed I had died in one of the recent raids. This was for the best. The fewer witnesses, the greater the chance the mission would last at least a day. Ahead of me lay 3 empires, each of which hated the other slightly more than the enemy beyond the stars. I didn't know if I could convince them. I didn't know if I would return at all. But there was a strange calm inside me, as if I had already lost everything and now had nothing left to fear. For the first time in many years, I felt alive, not an official, not a tool, but simply a person who, despite all the horror, was still capable of trying. The journey to the first empire took 6 long days. I remember looking through the viewport as the blue lines of the hyper corridors dissolved into the boundless void of space, and reflecting that perhaps true diplomacy is not about lavish assemblies and loud speeches, but a solitary flight through the darkness where no one is waiting for you with open arms. I didn't know that ahead of me were people who would see me as an enemy, not a messenger of peace. But at that moment, I believed that if even one of them agreed to listen, it would be the first step towards something greater, towards the hope of understanding. I was greeted not by applause, but by the barrel of a plasma rifle. Honestly, I expected something similar, but it was still unpleasant when your diplomatic mission begins with a search and a humiliating molecular code scan. In their eyes, I was a spy, a traitor, and, incidentally, an idiot who showed up with false documents in the very heart of an empire that had recently accused my faction of destroying its own fleet. I tried to explain that I had come not to fight, but to negotiate. But the security drone merely scanned my skull coldly and stated that I had an abnormally high stress level. I wanted to reply that any normal person would be nervous standing before a machine capable of erasing him in a fraction of a second, but I kept silent. In diplomacy, silence often speaks louder than 100 arguments. The empire was not the place I had once served. Its cities had darkened, the streets were filled with patrols, and people's faces were blank. Holograms with slogans about unity in the face of external threat hung everywhere, but I knew that panic was hiding behind them. When everything collapses, it's easier to invent a slogan than a plan. I was housed in an old administrative complex where the walls still remembered the smell of ink and the dust of times when officials were more important than generals. On the 3rd day of my stay, an internal security agent accidentally contacted me, hinting that my messages were being intercepted and that some personnel were working against me. Basically, nothing new. In any diplomatic field, the first thing you learn is who is going to set you up, and you try to use that to your advantage. I understood that it would be impossible to convince them with words alone. They needed evidence, real, tangible proof that couldn't be hidden behind propaganda. I retrieved the records from the orbital sensors, the very footage showing the drone fleet eliminating all life while leaving the infrastructure untouched. It looked like a surgical operation devoid of emotion. I knew these frames would cause shock, but I didn't expect them to frighten even the military. When the recording reached the council, I was summoned to a meeting. The people sitting there looked like they slept an hour a night. I told them everything about the fleets that no longer responded, about the systems consumed by the alien mind, about how without unification, we stood no chance. They listened in silence, and I couldn't tell if they believed me or were just waiting for me to finish so they could give the order to arrest me. The answer came at night. I was awakened by an alarm and the sounds of gunfire somewhere below. One of the officers, with whom I had managed to exchange a few words over dinner, burst into my quarters and said the building was under attack. Later, I learned it was an act of sabotage, a group of radicals who decided it was better to destroy the alien emissary than allow him to infect the council with foreign lies. We broke through a back corridor where the ventilation groaned like a wounded animal. A transport shuttle was waiting for us at the exit, and by a miracle alone, we reached the orbital station. I was sure it was over. The mission had failed, trust was gone, and support as well. But in the morning, a message was handed to me. The council was ready to consider a proposal for temporary cooperation. The irony of fate, to convince people of the truth, someone had to try to kill you. When I left the station, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The First Empire had agreed to enter negotiations, but this was only a small victory. There were others ahead, more dangerous, more isolated, more insane. I didn't know how much further I would have to go, but a quiet feeling arose inside. For the first time in a long time, someone had heard me. And perhaps that is where salvation begins. Not with victories, not with treaties, but with the moment when one person decides that another is worth believing. I always believed the worst thing a person could face was drones wiping civilizations off the map. I was wrong. Worse is bureaucracy, especially the kind convinced it can defeat even the apocalypse if the paperwork is filed correctly. When I arrived at the First Empire, I was met not with suspicion or hostility, but with indifference. That was more insulting. My shuttle hung in the quarantine zone for 8 hours while some official verified whether my pass had the correct shade of stamp. They were even checking the signature of a ship captain who hadn't existed for 3 months. He had died on an orbital station destroyed by the drone fleet. But the system demanded confirmation, and the system always demanded more than common sense. I realized that if these people survived, it would be solely due to their inability to make decisions. The city greeted me with silence and neon signs urging citizens to believe in the might of the empire. Beneath them stood people, tired and wary, as if every step might be their last. I headed to the Central Council building, where I was supposed to be granted access to strategic data. At the entrance, an officer stopped me, claiming he had orders not to let foreign emissaries without escort pass. There was, of course, no escort. I tried to explain that my mission was approved at the highest level, that we were talking about saving all of us. But the officer merely shrugged and said he was not authorized to make decisions. That's when I realized I would have to find another way. The irony was that all my diplomatic skills, years of training, subtle phrasing, the ability to read between the lines, were worthless against a system where no one wanted to take responsibility, not even for opening a door. Everything changed at night when I witnessed an act of sabotage. Unknown operatives had hacked the power supply system and launched a virus intended to cause a chain reaction in the defense drones. If it had worked, half the city would have destroyed itself. I managed to intercept the signal and switch the backup power manually. Don't ask me how. I didn't fully understand what I was doing myself. I just acted on instinct, as if my brain had switched into emergency mode. When it was all over and the power came back on, I noticed a woman in an engineer's uniform. She stood by the terminal, pale, but with an expression that suggested she believed for the first time in a long while that the world could be saved. It later turned out she was a key figure in the council's technical department, a person whose word carried weight. It was she who submitted my sensor data and the attack footage to the council. With her help, I managed to prove that the drone fleet moved with indifference to flags and borders. After a few days, everything changed. I was assigned quarters, security, and the status of a temporary representative. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I hadn't risked my life in vain. But with this came a strange realization. None of them truly believed we could win. They agreed to the alliance not out of hope, but out of fear. I saw it in their eyes, the fear of being next. And perhaps fear became my first ally. We began assembling scattered forces, surviving squads, independent flotillas, even pirates who had nothing left to lose. For the first time in a long time, I heard the phrase, common goal. And yet, deep down, I understood that this was only the beginning. Because if uniting people is difficult, convincing them to trust each other is almost impossible. I always considered the worst place in the universe to be empty space, cold, silent, indifferent. But then I found myself in the heart of the hostile empire and realized that emptiness can have a shape, a smell, and even a voice. Their capital city hung in clouds of toxic mist, like the rotting corpse of a giant who long stopped caring if it was dead or alive. My ship entered the atmosphere under the code of a humanitarian mission, though there was nothing on board but me and a hastily fabricated stack of documents. I knew that if even one inspection drone breached my data, I wouldn't face prison. I would simply be vaporized on the spot. But at some point, adrenaline ceases to be fear. It becomes fuel. And then all you can do is fly, until the very end, until the oxygen or the arguments run out. On the surface, everything looked different than I had imagined. No marches, no grandstands, no fanatic crowds shouting slogans. Only silence and a gray fog in which buildings resembling the ribs of giant machines dissolved. It seemed the empire itself had burned out its emotions, leaving only discipline and fear. I was met by soldiers, faceless, in identical helmets. They took everything, my communicator, my pass, even my boots, as if I posed a threat to the very floor I walked on. I was led to a waiting room that smelled of metal and cold. I sat there for several hours until the order finally came. I was taken to the council. These were people whose eyes glowed with the same blue tint, the result of emotion-regulating implants. I realized that the claims that they felt no pity were not propaganda. It was physiology. The negotiations began, if you could even call it that. I spoke of the catastrophe, of the drone fleet that was wiping out entire systems, making no distinction between flags and borders. I spoke of how an alliance was not a weakness, but an instinct for survival. They listened, never interrupting, never moving, never blinking. It was like I was addressing statues, not living beings. One of them said that the empire does not negotiate with threats. That's when I realized if I continued to speak only in figures and facts, they wouldn't believe me. So I started speaking differently. I told them how I looked out the viewport of a destroyed cruiser and watched thousands of people in spacesuits fly into the abyss, all because someone, long ago, had decided that another's pain was not their problem. I said that indifference is also a form of suicide, merely stretched out over time. After those words, the silence changed. It seemed to come alive. Someone on the council shifted their posture, someone tilted their head, and for the first time, I felt there were still remnants of the human within this cold place. They told me they needed to assess the risk and withdrew, leaving me under guard. At that moment, I was sure it was the end. But then, I was led out, not to execution, but to an observation dome. One of the Empire's leaders stood there. He said he saw something in my eyes that he hadn't seen in his people for a long time, fear and resolve simultaneously. He called it an unprofitable but honest combination. A few hours later, the first agreement was signed. They agreed to provide surveillance technology and a portion of their fleet. I left there alive, but inside, I felt that a part of me remained among those cold walls. Sometimes, when I recall that day, it feels like I myself became a little more like them, calm, rational, and slightly less alive. If someone had told me back then that the key to the alien intelligence smelled like burnt insulation and machine oil, I would have laughed. And then, probably, asked who exactly among us had gone mad. But that's precisely how it turned out. After the attack on Station Orion 4, we were gathering fragments of drones that were melting right in our hands, and among them, our technician, a young guy named Sal, found something like an organic node, half metal, half tissue. It pulsed like a heart, and with every beat, I felt a slight ringing in my ears, as if someone were whispering through the radio static. I first thought it was just sensor overload, but then this whisper began to form a rhythm. Not words, not images, just a sense of presence, alien yet not hostile. It was watching. And most terrifyingly, it was learning about us. We placed the discovery in a containment block and connected it to a scanner. The analysis showed that the structure was not merely biomechanical. It was something akin to a network of neurons linked by quantum connections, yet each part could function autonomously. In other words, this piece of the drone continued to think, even though nothing but ash remained of the rest of the craft. That's when I first realized that the alien mind was not a single entity, but a distributed system, like a galactic brain stretched over thousands of light years. But every brain has a center, and, according to the data, the impulses inside the fragment followed a clear, cyclical pattern, repeating like breathing. We called it the core, the rhythmic signal controlling the entire swarm. If we could find the source, we could disrupt the synchronization. In simple terms, we could blind it. But the deeper we delved into the research, the stranger things became. Some team members started experiencing perceptual failures. They complained of ringing in their heads, of images flashing before their eyes, cities that never existed, stars burning in reverse. Someone heard their own voice speaking of things that hadn't happened yet. When it happened to me, I finally understood that we weren't just observing the mind, we had become part of its field. I saw fragments of memories, but they didn't belong to a human. It was something ancient, weary, almost alive in its melancholy. It wasn't attacking for the sake of destruction, it was defending itself, like an organism reacting to an infection. And to it, we were merely an infection disturbing the peace. I tried to record the signal, isolate the rhythm, and at some point, I found a repeating pause, a slight shift in the cycle, barely noticeable. But there was a logic to this shift, as if someone was blinking, taking a breath between thoughts. We calculated the frequency and sent a reverse impulse to check the reaction. And then, everything around us froze. The drones that were attacking our orbit simply stopped. They didn't fall, didn't explode. They just froze in space, as if time had ceased to exist. The signal from the fragment distorted and vanished. We thought we had won, but at that moment, I felt something looking at me from the inside, not through walls or instruments, but directly through my consciousness. And I understood. We hadn't found the enemy's weakness. We had opened a door that no one should have touched. I never thought I would hear applause in a hall where only threats had resonated for years. I stood in the middle of the main council, surrounded by people who, just yesterday, dreamed of erasing each other from the face of the universe. The holographic panels glowed with the emblems of the three empires, so different, as if they belonged not just to different cultures, but different species. Yet now, they slowly converged into a single image, a silver star on a black background, the symbol of a new pact I hadn't even dared to dream of a month ago. I felt no pride, only exhaustion. The kind that burns from the inside after a long fight where the opponent wasn't the enemy outside, but human folly itself. When the council chairman announced the formation of a united command, the hall erupted in flashes of light, diplomatic drones documenting the historical moment. I just stood there, contemplating how much blood this fragile moment of agreement had cost and whether it would shatter at the first shot. After the meeting, I was shown the first blueprint for the United headquarters. It was situated in an old communication node between the empires, Station Frontier. It had previously served as a transit point for smugglers and scouts, and now it was slated to become the center of the unified fleet. When I arrived, the air was thick with steam and welding smoke, and the corridors resembled a teeming hive. In one compartment, officers of the Shin Empire argued with tacticians from the Tarian Dominion, while our own neutral coordinators stood between them, trying to explain that a single map could not simultaneously belong to everyone. I watched this madness and understood. Diplomacy had ended and alchemy had begun. We were trying to fuse metal of different temperatures without causing an explosion. Every order passed through dozens of filters, and every decision became encumbered with bureaucracy. But despite the chaos, something began to take shape. We didn't trust each other, but we feared the alien mind more than betrayal. And perhaps, for the first time, fear made us allies. I attended the activation ceremony for the United Command. In the center of the station stood an enormous sphere housing the synchronous neuro headquarters, the brain of the new army. Each fleet transferred a portion of its navigation data and control systems. When the impulse passed through the communication lines, thousands of markers lit up in space. These were our ships, aligned in a common formation. I caught myself thinking then that I was seeing not empires, but a single pattern, as if the galaxy itself had decided that there had been enough war. But the joy didn't last long. Within hours of signing the pact, the first rumors of sabotage began. Someone was forging orders, leaking coordinates, trying to disrupt the setup of communication channels. I realized that time was working against us. The alliance only existed as long as there was a common enemy. If the alien disappeared, we would be back to tearing at each other's throats. And yet, looking at the lights of the fleet ready for battle, I believed for the first time in a long time that maybe this fragile, shaky belief was precisely what made everything else worth enduring. I had never seen stars tremble. They were always something constant, indifferent to human affairs, motionless even during the most terrible wars. But that day, they seemed to shudder themselves. Maybe it was an illusion, the reflection of fire on the hull or the pulse of shields. But as I looked out the command bridge viewport, it felt as though the universe itself had blinked. Then, I understood that we had truly started not just a battle, but a test of survival for the entire civilization. The Alien Minds drone fleet appeared without warning. No radio signals, no hyper-transition traces. They seemed to materialize from the vacuum. Thousands of dots on the radar, like a swarm of predatory insects, filled the sector containing our frontier, the planet Helios 9. Dry, scorched, strategically insignificant at first glance, but its orbit held a quantum beacon, the only channel capable of delivering the strike against the vulnerability we had recently discovered. If the drones destroyed it, our entire mission would be meaningless. The Alliance Command acted as a single unit for the first time. Not without arguments, of course. I saw officers from the Tarian Empire scoff contemptuously at the orders of captains from the Union of Spheres, who, in turn, called them old-fashioned fanatics. But beneath the noise of quarrels, the flotillas moved, hundreds of ships forming dense battle formations. On the tactical screen, everything looked almost beautiful. Waves of energy, tracer fire, trajectory lines converging into a pattern that resembled a complex dance. Only this dance led to death. The first engagement was swift. The drones didn't charge head-on. They sliced through our formation, striking from hyperspace, bypassing communication ships and power nodes. It was as if they could sense our weak points. That's when I first experienced true terror from the alien intelligence. Not evil, not cruel, just incomprehensibly efficient. It contained neither hatred nor pity, only cold, geometrical effectiveness. I watched as one of the Empire's fleets died right before our eyes. The heavy Rada cruisers exploded almost simultaneously, turning into rings of wreckage. The radio waves were dead, only rare cries from engineers and reports of depressurization cut through. I tried to keep my voice steady while issuing commands, even though I knew half the ships couldn't hear us. We employed the old tactic of reflected fire, directing energy pulses through the station's orbital mirrors to fool the drone's targeting systems. It worked for a while. We even managed to shoot down several large units, possibly node carriers. Their hulls disintegrated like living tissues, and streams of silvery nanoparticles like dust burst from inside. No one knew if it was residual consciousness or just a mechanical reaction. But in that moment, I felt pity for them, alien, faceless, yet alive in their own way. The battle lasted 22 hours of standard time. By the 19th hour, I couldn't distinguish between friendly and enemy signals. The space around Helios 9 had turned into a boiling mass of debris and plasma. The entire orbit was burning, as if the planet itself had decided to become a sun. But, despite everything, we held the position. The beacon survived. When the dust settled, I saw the remnants of the fleet, just 36 ships out of nearly 400, slowly forming up. Each one was wounded, warped, but holding its line. In that moment, I realized that the alliance was not forged at a council, nor with the signing of a pact. But right here, in this slaughter, where we first stopped being strangers, we didn't win. We simply didn't die. And on a cosmic scale, that was already an achievement. I thought all my worst fears had already been processed into a plan of action. Evacuation maps, priority lists, a few cycles of an SOS signal, and a tiny bottle of whiskey in my pocket for courage. And all of it seemed laughably insignificant when I was told I would lead the operation right into the head of the Hound network. The initial gut punch was simple and vicious. If we failed this, any other plan would be meaningless. I remember looking at the vulnerability schematics we pulled from the wreckage and thinking that sometimes the fate of civilization is decided at the level of frequency and pause, like a bad joke about a poor conductor. We weren't just going to attack, we were going to enter the enemy's consciousness and switch off the light with a careful press. It felt like searching a great predator's house. Quietly, tiptoeing in socks and without making unnecessary noise, yet with the thought that one loud step would ruin everything. I felt a nervous laugh hiding somewhere behind my sternum, because all I had was my charisma, old contacts, and a couple of tricks that had replaced live ammunition for years, and it was both funny and terrifying, entrusting the fate of all life to my ability to look good under pressure. Under the cover of the unified fleet, we crawled toward the target, and the whole thing looked like a bad joke about optimization. Thousands of ships created an orbital tapestry we hid beneath, like ants under a broken leaf, shielding them from bursting lava. Our raiders flew in the thin shadow of a beam, slipping through the loopholes the beacon gave us, and on the bridge, my eyes kept twitching, because responsibility wasn't a word, but a constant sour taste in my mouth. We knew that the vulnerability wasn't just a point on a map, but a rhythm that could be changed. I felt like the conductor of an invisible orchestra. The synchronization of thousands of mechanisms depended on my single wave, and if someone missed a beat, the orchestra would play death. I remembered once trying to catch a butterfly as a child and tearing its wing in the process, thinking I was saving it. That's when I first understood that good intentions could be cruel. Now, I realized that our intentions didn't just have to be good, they had to be precise, and that was terrifying. We breached the target precisely at the moment when everything around us seemed to freeze in anticipation. On the approach to the Hound Network's flagship, the world felt alien. No smells, no sounds, only the pure, almost religious silence of machines. My team looked like a group of people who had laughed too long to cry. Each one brought their own oddities, their rituals, their small, funny quirks to keep from going insane. We launched the counter-frequency impulse, our small lie into the large consciousness. I remember the screen shuddering and the markers on the tactical map winking out one by one. The drones that had just been circling orbit stopped moving, their trajectories falling into the blackness. But the joy was short-lived. When we directed the impulse at the core, it responded not with an explosion or a reboot, but with a quiet, almost human sigh that pierced right through me. That sigh brought with it memories, not mine. And suddenly, I felt as though I was seeing the world through its eyes, millions of nodes connected to a single pain, a single sense of loneliness. I felt a strange pity that I couldn't afford to speak aloud. The feeling caused my heart to skip a beat, yet I couldn't suppress it. The finale was not cinematic. It was precise and strangely cold. We didn't blow up the flagship or unleash a chain of destruction. We introduced a micro-shift into its rhythm that generated a correlation error. It was like someone whispering the wrong word and the song ceasing to sing. The system weakened, and at that moment, our stealth teams penetrated the core, installed the device, and I felt as if someone was closing the door to a room where the light had been out for a long time. The consequences were slow, yet vividly apparent. The drone swarm became confused. Many shut down, some simply stopped and settled into orbit like tired birds, and our allied fleet, which had served as a screen, suddenly became visible not as a collection of flags, but as a living whole, united by one purpose. But immediately after, I felt the cost. Part of the team remained inside the silence. Someone gave their life in a minuscule error. Someone lost their mind, which would never return to its former state. I sat there as everyone returned, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about victory, but about how we had changed. The victory was real, but it was also harsh. We survived, but we became different, quieter and more attentive to the pauses. And as I looked at the people around me, I understood that this wasn't the end of the story, but its very loud yet vulnerable continuation. We had learned to deliver precise strikes, but we had not yet learned to live with those whom those strikes left in the shadows. When it was all over, for the first time in a long time, I could breathe without the constant tension in my chest, although my ribcage still remembered what we had endured. The alien mind no longer existed in a form that could threaten us, but the traces of its presence remained in every roar of debris, in every flickering residue of energy that occasionally ran through the fleet's remaining systems. I sat on the bridge of the command center, looking out at the void where the battle had recently raged, and realized that we had won not because of strength, but because we had learned to trust each other, albeit out of necessity. The Alliance survived its first test, but the cost was hundreds of ships, thousands of lives, and millions of tons of lost resources. I saw the faces of the officers who had previously cursed and despised each other, and now understood that they had changed just as I had. Some became silent, some cautious, some overly dreamy. We all bore scars that not even time could erase, and these scars became a symbol that the long road to peace is not a fairy tale, but a constant struggle against ourselves and our circumstances. The first weeks after the operation were strange. The Empire planets started exchanging signals again, but they sounded different. Not like a challenge, not like a threat, but like cautious steps, like children trying to walk on their own for the first time. I participated in negotiations that once seemed absurd, sharing technology, planning joint patrols, discussing routes for future trade fleets. Sometimes, a sense of dark humor would wash over me when I thought about how just a few months ago, these same people were preparing to shoot each other for the sake of their own ambitions, and now we were collectively building a system that could save dozens of planets. It was the comical side of our tragedy, at once funny and terrifying, that the world held together by such shaky threads of trust. But that trust became our strength. We understood that we could stand against any external enemy if there was even a drop of consensus within us. I often recalled the team I went through all this with. We laughed at moments when death was almost touching us, argued about who was keeping score of the losses, who had whose back, and sometimes our jokes seemed divinely stupid. And it was exactly these moments that made us feel alive, despite the catastrophe. I realized that the war changed more than just physical coordinates and front lines. It changed us, teaching us to value the moment in the face of chaos, teaching us to see something more than just an enemy in the eyes of others. When we stood in orbit above Helios 9, viewing the remnants of the fleet, I felt something like hope for the first time. Not certainty, not joy, but that quiet, cautious hope that maybe, someday, peace would become not just a temporary pause between wars, but a true state of existence. We began restoring the shattered worlds, creating joint scientific centers and research stations. I watched engineers from different empires working side by side for the first time, soldiers exchanging experience, sometimes arguing, but without hatred. It was a strange feeling to see something new being born from chaos, fear, and loss. Every new project, every restored station became a small victory. And although the shadows of past battles didn't disappear, I felt that we had learned to look beyond fear and revenge. We understood that the alliance was not just a military necessity, but a way to change the very fabric of the future. In the epilogue, I often look at the stars and think about how easily they appear constant. Now I know that they witnessed our struggle, and perhaps their silent presence gave us the chance not to lose ourselves. Peace between the empires remains fragile, but for the first time in centuries, we proved that we can unite in the face of a threat. I feel that this is only the beginning of a new era, an era where we learn to live with the consequences of our actions, where we value alliance not as convenience, but as a necessity, and where each of us bears responsibility for the common future. And although the future remains unknown, I can finally tell myself that we took a step toward it together. And perhaps that step is enough to keep the universe from laughing too cruelly at us.